A cop stops black twins driving alone in a raging storm expecting trouble. But when he shines his flashlight inside the car, what he sees changes everything. An unconscious woman in the back seat and two terrified kids desperately gripping the wheel. What made these young boys take control of a car? And why does the officer instantly lock down the entire street, calling for backup like the world depends on it? As the storm rages on, secrets unravel, and every second counts. But the biggest question remains: can these twins save their mother's life before time runs out? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the kitchen counter as Janelle flipped another perfect pancake onto the growing stack. The warm, sweet smell of breakfast filled their cozy suburban home, mixing with the sound of cheerful bickering from the kitchen table where 7-year-old twins Caleb and Cameron sat. "Mom, Cameron's stealing all the syrup again," Caleb protested, reaching across the table for the bottle. "Am not." Cameron pulled the syrup closer, protecting it like treasure. "You always use too much anyway." Janelle turned from the stove, her warm brown eyes crinkling with amusement. "Boys, there's plenty for everyone," she said softly, placing fresh pancakes on each of their plates. She watched with motherly pride as both boys immediately forgot their quarrel, diving into their breakfast with identical expressions of delight. Outside in the attached garage, David wiped his hands on an old rag, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his tools and equipment. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows, catching on the chrome details of his prized possession, a restored classic car he'd been working on for months. "Dad, can we start it up?" Caleb asked eagerly, pressing his face against the driver's side window. Cameron hung back slightly but looked just as interested. David glanced toward the kitchen, then grinned. "All right, boys, come here. I want to show you something." He opened the driver's door and motioned for them to get closer. "Now this is very important. You're never supposed to do this without an adult, understand?" Both boys nodded solemnly, their eyes wide with excitement. "First, you need to make sure it's in park," David explained, pointing to the gear shift. "Then you turn the key just like this." The engine roared to life, making Cameron jump slightly while Caleb beamed. "Can we try?" Caleb asked, practically bouncing with enthusiasm. David lifted each boy up to sit on his lap, one at a time, letting them grip the steering wheel and feel the engine's vibration. "Remember," he said seriously, "this is just for fun. You're never supposed to actually drive without an adult." Janelle appeared in the garage doorway, shaking her head but smiling. "Teaching our boys bad habits already?" "They're smart enough never to need it," David assured her, helping the twins climb down. "Just having a little fun before work." After a few months, one morning after David had left for his shift at the auto shop, the house settled into a peaceful quiet. Caleb and Cameron sprawled on the living room floor with their toys, occasionally arguing over whose turn it was to be the hero in their elaborate game. Janelle sat on the couch nearby, a book open in her lap, though her eyes kept drifting to the darkening sky outside. The weather had turned quickly, heavy clouds rolling in and blocking out the morning sunshine. A distant rumble of thunder made Cameron look up nervously. "It's okay, sweetie," Janelle reassured him, but her words were interrupted by a small cough. She cleared her throat softly and returned to her book. The storm grew stronger, wind whipping through the trees outside their windows. A particularly bright flash of lightning was followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. "Mom?" both boys called out simultaneously in the sudden darkness. "I'm right here," Janelle answered calmly, setting aside her book. She coughed again, this time a bit more noticeably. "Let's find some flashlights, shall we?" Next day, thunder rumbled outside as Caleb and Cameron sat cross-legged on the living room floor, their colored pencils scratching against paper in the dim emergency lighting. Caleb was drawing their family's car, carefully adding details just like Dad had taught him, while Cameron worked on a picture of their house. A harsh coughing sound echoed from the kitchen. Caleb's green pencil paused mid-stroke as he lifted his head, listening. The coughing continued, growing deeper and more concerning with each passing moment. "Mom?" Caleb called out, his small voice wavering. There was no response, just more coughing. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor made both boys jump. A glass shattered, followed by a terrible, gasping noise. "Mom!" Caleb scrambled to his feet, his drawing forgotten. He rushed into the kitchen, Cameron close behind him. Janelle lay crumpled on the tile floor, one hand clutching her chest while the other grasped desperately at nothing. Her face had taken on a frightening bluish tinge, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. "What's happening to Mom?" Cameron cried, tears already streaming down his face. He hovered uncertainly in the doorway, his whole body trembling. Caleb dropped to his knees beside their mother, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. "Mom, wake up." He shook her shoulder gently, then more urgently when she didn't respond. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. "Mom, please." With shaking hands, Caleb reached for the phone on the kitchen counter. He dialed 911 just like they'd learned in school, but nothing happened. The line was dead. Panic rising in his chest, he ran to get his mother's cell phone from her purse. No signal. "Cameron, stay with Mom," Caleb ordered, his voice cracking. He raced to the front door and out into the storm, rain immediately soaking through his t-shirt. The wind whipped around him as he ran first to Mrs. Peterson's house next door, pounding on the door with both fists. No answer. He tried the house on the other side, then across the street, his desperation growing with each empty response. The whole neighborhood seemed deserted, everyone either at work or away from the storm. Back inside, Caleb found Cameron sitting on the floor beside their mother, holding her hand and crying softly. Janelle's breathing had become even more labored, each intake of air a terrible wheeze. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway, tears mixing with rainwater on his face as he stared at his mother's unconscious form. His mind raced, remembering all the times Dad had shown them how to start the car, how to put it in drive, how to steer. It had been a game then, but now... He turned to Cameron, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're driving her to the hospital." But Dad said we're never supposed to drive without an adult," Cameron whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "We don't have a choice," Caleb replied, already moving to help their mother. "She needs help now. Are you with me?" Cameron looked at their mother's pale face, then back at his twin brother. Slowly, he nodded, wiping tears from his cheeks with the back of his hand. Together, they began the seemingly impossible task of trying to move their mother, their small bodies straining with effort, but driven by love and desperate determination. The garage door groaned as Caleb pushed it open with trembling hands. Rain poured in sideways, driven by fierce gusts that made the old wooden structure creak. Their father's sedan sat waiting, its dark blue paint gleaming dully in the dim light. For a moment, Caleb froze, the enormity of what they were about to do hitting him like a physical blow. Behind them, in the doorway connecting the garage to the house, Janelle lay unconscious on a blanket they'd managed to drag her onto. Her breathing was getting worse, each inhale a painful whistle that tore at Caleb's heart. I don't know about this," Cameron whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Maybe we should wait." "Mom needs us!" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He yanked open the driver's side door, the familiar smell of leather and Dad's coffee hitting him. "We can't wait. Please, Cameron." Cameron stood rooted to the spot, tears mixing with rain on his face. His whole body shook as he watched Caleb climb onto the driver's seat, looking impossibly small behind the large steering wheel. "Help me get Mom in first," Caleb ordered, trying to sound braver than he felt. Together, they struggled with the blanket, pulling and pushing until they managed to get their mother lying across the back seat. Caleb tucked her legs in carefully, his hand lingering on her ankle. She felt so cold. "Get in," Caleb said, gesturing to the passenger seat. When Cameron hesitated again, Caleb reached across and pushed the door open wider. "Please, I can't do this alone." Those words seemed to break through Cameron's fear. He scrambled into the seat, immediately pulling his knees up to his chest and wrapping his arms around them. Caleb's hands shook as he reached for the keys hanging from the hook by the garage door. The metal felt ice cold against his palm. It took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition, just like Dad had shown them, but this time, it wasn't a game. The engine roared to life, making both boys jump. Caleb's foot could barely reach the brake pedal, even with the seat pushed all the way forward. He gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, trying to remember everything their father had taught them. "Brake down, shift to reverse," he muttered to himself, following his own instructions. The car jerked backward suddenly, causing Cameron to yelp and grab the dashboard. Rain hammered against the windshield as Caleb carefully steered down the driveway, the wipers slapping furiously against the downpour. Tears streamed down his face as he concentrated harder than he ever had in his life, his small body rigid with tension. The car lurched onto the main road, headlights cutting yellow paths through the darkness of the storm. Neither boy spoke as Caleb struggled to keep the massive vehicle straight, his arms straining against the wheel. Every few seconds he glanced in the rearview mirror at their mother's pale face. A soft groan from the back seat made both boys' hearts skip a beat. Cameron twisted around in his seat to look at their mother, his face a mask of worry. "She's getting worse," he whispered. The car swerved slightly as Caleb wiped his eyes with one sleeve, trying to see through his tears and the rain. The empty road ahead seemed to stretch forever, the storm making everything look unfamiliar and threatening. Their usual route to the hospital had never felt so long or dangerous. In the back seat, Janelle's breathing continued to rasp, each labored breath a reminder of why they had no choice but to keep going, no matter how terrified they were. The old sedan weaved down the empty street, its headlights cutting unsteady paths through the darkness. Caleb's arms trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his feet barely reaching the pedals. Every few seconds, the car would drift toward the curb, making both boys gasp in terror. "Watch out!" Cameron cried as they narrowly missed a blue mailbox. The car swerved sharply, and Caleb fought to straighten it out again. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. In the back seat, Janelle's breathing had grown more labored, each intake of air a painful wheeze that filled the car. Cameron twisted around in his seat again, reaching back to touch their mother's hand. "Hang on, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please hang on." The windshield wipers beat frantically against the rain, but Caleb could barely see through his tears and the water streaming down the glass. Streetlights blurred into golden smears as he squinted ahead, trying to remember which turns would lead them to the hospital. Suddenly, a dark shape loomed out of the darkness. "Caleb!" Cameron screamed. A parked car materialized directly in their path. Caleb yanked the wheel hard to the left, the sedan's tires squealing on the wet pavement. They missed the parked car by inches, the sudden movement throwing both boys against their doors. "I can't do this," Caleb sobbed, his whole body shaking. "I'm scared, Cameron." "You have to," Cameron whispered back, reaching over to squeeze his brother's arm. "Mom needs us to be brave." 3 blocks away, Officer James Brady sat in his cruiser, taking a slow sip of lukewarm coffee. The storm had kept most people off the roads, making for an unusually quiet night shift. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he noticed headlights in the distance moving erratically. Brady straightened in his seat, coffee forgotten as he watched the vehicle weave from side to side. His first thought was a drunk driver, but something about the car's movement seemed off. It moved too slowly, too uncertainly, as if the driver was struggling with basic control. "What in the world?" he muttered, flicking on his cruiser's lights and pulling out onto the street. As he drew closer, he could see it was a dark blue sedan, swerving dangerously close to parked cars and mailboxes. The wail of police sirens cut through the storm's fury. In the sedan, Caleb felt his blood turn to ice. Red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror, reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. "Oh no," Cameron whimpered, shrinking down in his seat. "It's the police." Caleb's mind raced with panic. Would they arrest him? Would they take Mom away? Would they be too late to save her? The questions swirled in his head as Officer Brady's cruiser pulled alongside them. A bright beam of light swept through their windows as Brady shone his flashlight into the car. For a moment, there was absolute silence, except for the pounding rain and Janelle's labored breathing. Brady's eyes widened in shock as the beam illuminated two small, terrified faces. Children. There were children in the car. His speaker crackled to life as he called out, "Pull over to the side of the road. Now!" Caleb stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, tears streaming down his face. Cameron covered his ears against the sound of the sirens, squeezing his eyes shut. "Please," Brady's voice boomed through the speaker again. "Pull over to the right." With trembling hands, Caleb guided the car toward the curb, the tires bumping against it before coming to an uneven stop. The engine sputtered and died as his foot slipped off the gas pedal. Through the rain-streaked window, he could see Officer Brady approaching, his gun drawn and pointed at the ground. "Driver, put your hands where I can see them." Brady's voice was firm and authoritative, masking his growing concern about the car's erratic movement. Caleb's small fingers fumbled with the window control, tears blurring his vision as he rolled it down. The rain immediately swept in, cold drops hitting his face and mixing with his tears. His hands shook as he raised them, barely visible above the steering wheel. Officer Brady's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the car. The light caught Caleb's face first, round, tear-stained cheeks, eyes wide with terror. Then it shifted to Cameron, curled up in the passenger seat, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Brady's arm holding the gun dropped to his side, his mouth falling open in shock. "Dear God," he whispered, holstering his weapon with trembling fingers. These weren't criminals or drunk drivers. They were children. Babies, really. Moving quickly now, Brady yanked open the back door, his flashlight beam landing on Janelle's unconscious form. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow and irregular. Rain poured into the open door as Brady leaned in to check her pulse. Weak, but present. "Dispatch, this is Officer Brady." He barked into his radio, his voice urgent. "I need immediate medical assistance at Cedar and 4th. Female, mid-30s, unconscious, labored breathing. And..." He paused, glancing at the boys. "Send backup." "She doesn't have time." Caleb's scream cut through the sound of rain and thunder. He twisted in his seat, his face contorted with desperation. "Please, you have to help us. Mom needs to get to the hospital right now." The raw anguish in the boy's voice hit Brady like a physical blow. He stared at Caleb's pleading face, and for a moment he saw another child, a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Emily, his daughter, the one he couldn't save in time. Cameron's quiet voice broke through Brady's momentary paralysis. "We tried calling 911, he whispered, hiccuping through his tears. "But the phones wouldn't work, and nobody was home to help. We had to do something." Brady's training kicked in, pushing aside his shock and personal memories. He reached through the window, placing a gentle hand on Caleb's shoulder. "It's okay, son. You did good. You both did good. I'm going to help your mom now, all right?" Caleb nodded frantically, his small body finally releasing some of the tension he'd been holding. "You promise?" he asked, his voice small and desperate. "I promise," Brady replied firmly, already reaching for his radio again. The determination in his voice seemed to calm both boys slightly. This wasn't just another call anymore. This was his chance to make a difference, to save someone else's children from experiencing the loss he knew all too well. The storm continued to rage around them, but in that moment, a connection formed between the officer and the twins. They were no longer strangers on opposite sides of the law, but allies in a desperate race against time to save Janelle's life. Officer Brady's mind raced as he assessed the situation, his years of training crystallizing into a single, clear decision. The ambulance would take too long in this storm, and every second counted. He clicked his radio again, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Dispatch, update that location. I'm transporting the patient myself. Need immediate clearance on Cedar to Memorial Hospital. Have medical staff standing by." Thunder cracked overhead as Brady turned to Caleb, who was still gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice gentler now. "You did an amazing job getting your mom this far, but I need you to let me take over, okay? I want you and your brother to sit together in the back. Hold on to each other." Caleb hesitated for just a moment before nodding, his small shoulders sagging with relief. Brady helped him climb into the back seat, where Cameron immediately wrapped his arms around his brother. The twins huddled together, their faces pale in the darkness as Brady slid behind the wheel. The engine roared to life and Brady flipped on his emergency lights, casting red and blue shadows across the rain-slicked street. The car lurched forward, tires gripping the wet pavement as Brady navigated through the storm with practiced precision. "Dispatch, I need all intersections cleared between Cedar and Memorial," Brady barked into his radio. "This is a Code 3 medical emergency." His free hand tightened on the steering wheel as he took a corner faster than he normally would, the tires squealing slightly. In the rearview mirror, he could see the twins pressed together, their eyes darting between their unconscious mother and the road ahead. Janelle's breathing had become more labored, each inhale a struggled whisper that seemed to fill the car despite the storm raging outside. "Not today," Brady muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched tight. "I'm not losing anyone today." The words came out almost like a prayer, carrying the weight of old wounds and unspoken regrets. His daughter's face flashed through his mind again, but he pushed the memory aside, focusing on the road ahead. The speedometer crept higher as they raced through the empty streets, Brady's emergency lights clearing a path through the darkness. In the back seat, Caleb turned to Cameron, his voice barely a whisper. "What if Dad thinks it's our fault?" The words trembled with fear and guilt. "What if he gets mad that we took the car?" Cameron's arms tightened around his brother, their shared warmth a small comfort in the chaos. "He won't," Cameron whispered back, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "He taught us about the car for emergencies, remember? And this was an emergency." Tears rolled down Caleb's cheeks as he pressed closer to his twin. "I'm scared, Cam," he admitted, his voice breaking. "What if we weren't fast enough? What if—" "Both of you listen to me," Brady interrupted firmly but kindly, his eyes meeting theirs in the rearview mirror. "You boys did exactly what you needed to do. You're heroes, both of you. Your dad is going to be proud of how brave you were tonight." The twins fell silent, clinging to each other as the car sped through the storm. Brady's words hung in the air, a lifeline of hope in the darkness. Through the windshield, the hospital's emergency lights began to pierce the rain, growing brighter with each passing second. The police cruiser's tires splashed through deep puddles as Officer Brady navigated the treacherous streets. Rain hammered against the windshield in heavy sheets, making visibility difficult even with the wipers at full speed. In the back seat, Caleb and Cameron gripped their seatbelts tightly, their small bodies swaying with each sharp turn. Brady's radio crackled to life as he weaved between two stalled cars. "Dispatch, this is Officer Brady. I've got an unconscious woman and 2 kids in my car. I need the hospital route cleared now." His voice carried an urgency that made the twins exchange worried glances. The car lurched as Brady swerved to avoid another stalled vehicle, causing Janelle to shift slightly in her unconscious state. Cameron reached out to steady his mother, his hand trembling as he touched her arm. "Copy that, Officer Brady." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the static. "Be advised, we have reports of a jackknifed tanker truck blocking all lanes on Memorial Drive. The main route to the hospital is completely blocked." "We'll never get there," Caleb cried out, his voice cracking with panic. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at his mother's pale features. "Mom needs help now." Brady's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel harder. His jaw clenched as he processed the news, but his voice remained steady. "We'll find another way," he assured the boys, already calculating alternative routes in his mind. "There's always another way." The cruiser veered sharply onto a narrow side street, its tires bumping over broken pavement. Brady knew these back roads from his years of patrolling, every pothole, every shortcut, every alternative route. The car bounced roughly as he guided it through the maze of residential streets, each jolt drawing soft whimpers from the twins. Rain continued to pound against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the boys' quiet sobs. Through the rearview mirror, Brady caught glimpses of their tear-stained faces, illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. The sight stirred something deep within him, Memories of another rainy night, another desperate rush to the hospital, another child's tears. "She's strong," Brady said firmly, meeting their eyes in the mirror. "We'll get her there." His words carried a conviction that seemed to cut through the storm's chaos. "Your mom is fighting, and we're fighting with her. That's what matters right now." The car hit another deep pothole, causing everyone to bounce in their seats. Cameron clutched his brother's hand tighter, his eyes fixed on their mother's face. "Please hurry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Brady pressed down harder on the accelerator, forcing the cruiser through the flooded streets. The emergency lights painted the rain in alternating flashes of red and blue, creating an almost surreal atmosphere as they raced through the darkness. His radio continued to crackle with updates about the blocked main road, but Brady had already committed to his alternate route. "Dispatch," he called into his radio again. "I'm taking Riverside to Oak Street. Need any units in the area to clear those intersections. We're coming in hot." The response was immediate, confirming that available units were already moving to assist. The twins huddled closer together in the back seat, drawing strength from each other's presence as the car continued its desperate journey through the storm. Brady's eyes darted between the road ahead and his rearview mirror, watching both his path and his precious cargo with equal intensity. The old bridge loomed ahead through the curtain of rain, its narrow surface barely visible in the cruiser's headlights. Officer Brady slowed slightly as they approached, his experienced eyes scanning the deteriorating structure. The bridge had been a shortcut for locals for years, but tonight it looked more treacherous than ever. Caleb pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered down at the churning water below. The usually calm creek had transformed into an angry, swollen mass of muddy water that clawed at the bridge's supports. "It's flooding," Caleb whispered, his voice tight with fear. Cameron squeezed his brother's hand harder, shrinking back into his seat as the car began to cross the ancient structure. The bridge's surface was slick with rain, causing the tires to lose their grip almost immediately. Brady felt the car begin to slide sideways, the steering wheel suddenly light in his hands. His heart hammered in his chest as he fought to maintain control. "Hold on!" Brady shouted as the car fishtailed violently. The twins screamed in unison as the cruiser spun, its tires searching desperately for traction on the wet surface. Through the windshield, the bridge's edge seemed to rush toward them, the dark water below waiting hungrily. Cameron squeezed his eyes shut, burying his face in his brother's shoulder. Caleb couldn't look away, his small body rigid with terror as he watched Brady wrestling with the wheel. The officer's face was a mask of intense concentration, his jaw clenched tight as he fought against the skid. The cruiser's tires shrieked against the wet pavement as Brady countersteered, using every ounce of his training and experience. Time seemed to slow down as the car's back end swung dangerously close to the bridge's edge. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed certain they would go over. But Brady wasn't done fighting. With precise movements, he guided the sliding vehicle, working with the skid instead of against it. The car's momentum gradually shifted and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the cruiser straightened out. They burst off the bridge like a cork from a bottle, the tires finally finding purchase on solid ground. Brady hit the brakes, bringing the car to a controlled stop on the other side. The engine idled as everyone inside tried to catch their breath, the only other sound being the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Brady's hands were shaking slightly as he loosened his death grip on the steering wheel. He could hear the twins' ragged breathing from the back seat, punctuated by occasional whimpers. In the rearview mirror, he saw Caleb's wide, awestruck eyes staring at him. How did you do that?" Caleb stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Brady forced a smile, trying to project calm despite his own racing heart. "Sometimes you just hang on and steer," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. He glanced back at the boys, seeing the mix of fear and newfound trust in their expressions. They looked at him differently now, with a kind of wonder that made his throat tight with emotion. The radio crackled with another update from dispatch, but Brady took a moment to collect himself before responding. The bridge crossing had been risky, perhaps too risky, but they'd made it. He looked at Janelle's still form in the back seat, then at her brave sons, and knew he'd make the same choice again. The highway stretched before them like a dark ribbon, empty except for their lone vehicle cutting through the storm. Brady pressed harder on the accelerator, knowing every second counted. In the back seat, Cameron had fallen into an exhausted doze against his brother's shoulder, while Caleb kept his tired eyes fixed on their mother's pale face. Through the rearview mirror, Brady caught sight of something that made his stomach drop. The distinctive flash of red and blue lights in the distance. His jaw clenched as he realized what was happening. Not all units had been updated about their situation. The police cruisers grew larger in his mirrors, their sirens cutting through the steady drum of rain. Brady grabbed his radio, his voice tight with urgency. "This is Officer Brady. Stand down. We have a medical emergency." Only static answered his call, the storm interfering with communications. Caleb stirred, noticing the approaching lights. His voice trembled as he asked, "Why are they chasing us?" The question woke Cameron, who immediately pressed closer to his twin, eyes wide with fresh fear. "Don't worry," Brady said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "There's just been a mix-up." But inside, his mind raced. The pursuing officers thought they were chasing a stolen police cruiser, and they wouldn't hesitate to use force to stop it. The sirens grew louder, their wailing seeming to close in from all sides. Brady could see more flashing lights ahead. They were setting up a roadblock. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he made a split-second decision. Without warning, he yanked the wheel hard to the right, taking them off the main highway. The cruiser bounced roughly as it hit the exit ramp, jostling everyone inside. Janelle moaned softly from the back seat, the first sound she'd made in what felt like hours. Caleb immediately reached for her hand, whispering, "It's okay, Mom. We're getting help." Brady navigated through a maze of industrial streets, the wet pavement reflecting the glow of scattered security lights. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the other officers struggled to predict their route. The buildings loomed around them like silent sentinels, warehouses, factories, and empty loading docks. Finally, Brady pulled the cruiser behind an abandoned warehouse, cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt deafening. Rain pattered against the roof as they all caught their breath, the boys huddled together in the back seat. "Why did we stop?" Cameron asked, his voice small and frightened. Brady turned in his seat to face them, his expression serious but gentle. "They'll figure out who we are soon enough," he explained, running a hand through his rain-dampened hair. "Dispatch will sort this out. We just need to give them a minute to realize what's happening." Through the windshield, they could still see the distant flash of police lights, but they were more scattered now, searching the wrong areas. Brady's radio crackled again, and this time, through the static, they could hear voices trying to coordinate the search. "Are they going to arrest us?" Caleb asked, his lower lip trembling as he held onto his brother's hand. Brady shook his head firmly. "No, son, nobody's getting arrested. We're the good guys here, remember? Sometimes even the good guys have to take desperate measures when someone they love needs help." The boys nodded slowly, drawing comfort from his steady voice and unwavering determination. Through the rain-streaked windows, the industrial landscape provided temporary shelter from their pursuers, but Brady knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. Janelle needed help, and soon. The cruiser emerged from their hiding spot, wipers beating steadily against the relentless rain. Brady kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts drifted to the two brave boys in his back seat. The pursuing police cars had given up their search in the wrong area, leaving them alone on the wet streets. Cameron, who had been quietly watching the officer's face in the rearview mirror, finally gathered his courage. His voice was barely above a whisper when he asked, "Why are you helping us?" Brady's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His expression darkened, and for a moment, the only sound was the steady drum of rain against the roof. The question hit him hard, bringing back memories he'd tried so long to bury. Brady started, then stopped. He took a deep breath, glancing at the boys in his mirror. Their young faces reminded him so much of another face, one he saw every night in his dreams. "I had a daughter once. Her name was Emily." The word "had" hung heavy in the air. Caleb and Cameron exchanged glances, sensing the weight of Brady's words. Brady's mind drifted back to that terrible night years ago. The memories came flooding back, sharp and painful as ever. He could see himself in the backseat of his car, cradling his little Emily. Her small body had felt so light in his arms, her breathing labored and desperate. The traffic ahead had stretched endlessly, red brake lights blurring through his tears. "She got sick so suddenly," Brady continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like your mom. We were stuck in traffic. I screamed for help, flashed my lights, honked my horn. But nobody moved. Nobody could move." He swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "I watched her struggle to breathe, and I couldn't do anything. I was her father, a police officer, and I couldn't save her." The twins listened in complete silence, their eyes wide with understanding. In the back seat, Janelle's soft breathing seemed to echo Brady's words. "I held her until—" Brady's voice cracked and he couldn't finish the sentence. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. "That's why I'm helping you. I couldn't save Emily, but I won't let that happen to you two. I won't let your mother—" He trailed off, unable to continue. The car fell silent except for the steady rhythm of the wipers. Then, without a word, Caleb reached forward toward the glove compartment. He opened it carefully and pulled out a tissue, stretching his small arm toward Brady. Brady glanced down at the offered tissue and a faint smile crossed his face. Such a simple gesture, but it touched him deeply. He took the tissue with one hand, quickly wiping his eyes. "Thank you, Caleb," he said softly. The small act of kindness from a child he'd met just hours ago struck Brady's heart. These boys, despite their own fear and worry, still had room to care about his pain. It reminded him of Emily's gentle heart, how she'd always tried to make others feel better even when she was sick. "Emily would have liked you too," Brady said quietly, his smile growing a little stronger. The words felt right, healing something deep inside him that had been broken for so long. Through the curtain of rain, a massive building emerged in the distance, its windows glowing like beacons of hope. The hospital's emergency room signs cast red and white reflections on the wet pavement ahead. Brady felt his heart leap at the sight, and in the rearview mirror he saw Caleb's eyes widen with recognition. Caleb squeezed his brother's hand tightly, his voice trembling with relief. "We made it," he whispered to Cameron. The younger twin pressed his face against the window, tears mixing with foggy breath on the glass. The wipers continued their steady rhythm as they approached, pushing aside the lighter rainfall. For a brief moment, Brady allowed himself to believe the worst was behind them. Then his headlights illuminated something that made his stomach drop. A massive oak tree sprawled across the entire road, its rain-slick branches creating an impassable barrier. "No, no, no," Brady muttered, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. He brought the car to a stop about 20 feet from the fallen tree, his mind racing through their options. The detour would take too long. Janelle's breathing had grown more labored in the past few minutes. Brady turned to face the boys, his expression determined. "Stay in the car. I'm going to clear enough of this tree to get us through." Before either could respond, he was out in the rain, his uniform quickly becoming soaked as he approached the massive obstacle. The branches were heavy and slippery, and many still had leaves attached, making them awkward to move. Brady strained against the largest branch he could manage, his boots sliding in the mud as he tried to drag it aside. The rain ran down his face as he worked, each second feeling like an eternity. "Stay in the car," Cameron's voice carried through the rain. Brady looked up to see Caleb climbing out of the back seat, his small frame determined as he rushed toward the tree. "Caleb, get back inside!" Brady shouted, but the boy was already beside him, grabbing onto a smaller branch and pulling with all his might. "Mom needs us," Caleb said through gritted teeth, his pajamas already drenched. "I want to help." Brady looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw the same fierce determination he'd felt that night with Emily. There was no time to argue. "Okay," he nodded, "but be careful. These branches are slippery." Together they worked in the rain, Brady taking the heavier pieces while Caleb cleared smaller branches and debris. The boy's face was set in concentration, his small hands never stopping despite the cold and wet. Every few seconds he glanced back at the car where Cameron watched anxiously through the window, staying close to their mother. "Almost there," Brady encouraged as they cleared a narrow path. He could see it would be tight, but the car could make it through. Caleb's determination never wavered, even when he slipped in the mud. He simply got back up and kept working, showing a strength that touched Brady deeply. The rain continued to fall, but lighter now, as if nature itself was easing its assault to help them complete their task. With one final push from Brady and a last armful of branches from Caleb, they had carved a passage through the fallen tree. The car burst through the hospital's emergency entrance, tires squealing against wet pavement as Brady brought it to an abrupt stop. The emergency lights cast red and blue patterns across puddles in the parking lot, mixing with the hospital's stark fluorescent glow. "I need help here!" Brady's voice boomed across the lot as he jumped out of the driver's seat. "Unconscious woman, 2 kids in the back!" A team of paramedics rushed forward with a gurney, their scrubs dark with rain as they worked quickly to transfer Janelle from the back seat. Caleb and Cameron scrambled out of the car, their pajamas still dripping from the earlier tree-clearing effort. "BP's dropping," one paramedic called out as they wheeled Janelle toward the emergency room doors. "Get her inside now." The twins ran alongside the gurney until they reached the entrance. The automatic doors whooshed open, bringing a blast of sterile hospital air. They watched helplessly as their mother disappeared down a brightly lit corridor, doctors already swarming around her. Caleb turned suddenly, his small hands gripping Brady's rain-soaked uniform coat. Tears streamed down his face as he looked up at the officer. "Please don't let her die," he sobbed, his voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "Please." Brady knelt down to Caleb's level, his own eyes glistening. Cameron pressed close to his brother, shivering from cold and fear. A nurse approached them, her kind face creased with concern. She carried thick hospital blankets, which she draped around the boys' shoulders. "Let's get you 2 warmed up," she said gently, rubbing their arms through the blankets. "Your mom's in good hands now." Brady stepped back, leaning against the wall as he watched the medical team working on Janelle through the window of her room. His uniform was heavy with rain, and exhaustion showed clearly on his face. He watched the doctors move with practiced efficiency, calling out medical terms and adjusting equipment. "You're not losing her," he muttered under his breath, his hands clenched into fists. "Not this time." His words carried the weight of his past, of Emily, of another rainy night when he hadn't been fast enough. But this time was different. This time they'd made it. The emergency room buzzed with activity around them as nurses checked the boys' vital signs and doctors continued working to stabilize Janelle. Through it all, Brady remained close by, his presence a steady anchor for the frightened twins. In the stark hospital waiting room, Caleb and Cameron huddled close together on hard plastic chairs, their small frames wrapped in hospital blankets. Their eyes remained fixed on the emergency room doors, barely blinking, as if their mother might appear at any moment. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their worried faces. Officer Brady paced back and forth, his wet boots squeaking against the linoleum floor. Every few steps, he'd check his watch and glance toward the doors where doctors were still working on Janelle. His uniform was still damp from the rain, but he didn't seem to notice. A tall woman in a crisp business suit approached them, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her nameplate identified her as the hospital administrator, and her expression was stern as she zeroed in on Brady. "Officer," she said, her voice clipped and professional, "I need to discuss how 2 minors ended up behind the wheel of a vehicle during a severe storm. This is a serious matter that requires immediate attention." Brady stopped pacing and squared his shoulders. "Ma'am, with all due respect, these boys are heroes. Their mother was unconscious, the phones were down, and they did the only thing they could think of to save her life." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Instead of questioning their actions, you should be thanking them." Caleb and Cameron exchanged worried glances as they listened to the conversation. Cameron pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, while Caleb reached for his brother's hand. Before the administrator could respond, the emergency room doors swung open. A doctor in blue scrubs approached them, holding a clipboard. The boys sat up straighter, hope and fear mixing on their faces. "Your mother is stable for now," the doctor began, and both boys let out relieved sighs. But then his expression grew serious. "However, her blood work shows some concerning results. The symptoms and chemical markers in her system are consistent with some form of poisoning. Poison? Caleb's voice cracked as he spoke. His small hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his chair. Who would hurt our mom? Cameron started crying softly beside him, and Brady quickly moved closer to the boys, placing a reassuring hand on each of their shoulders. We're going to figure this out, Brady said firmly, though his face had darkened with concern. His jaw clenched as he processed this new information, his police instincts beginning to kick in. Your mom is safe now, and that's what matters most. The doctor continued explaining Janelle's condition to Brady, while the hospital administrator stood back, her earlier stern demeanor softening as she watched the scared brothers cling to each other. In a quiet corner of the hospital hallway, Brady stepped away from the boys and spoke quietly into his radio. Dispatch, I need a location check on David Matthews, husband of our victim. He kept his voice low, but Caleb's ears perked up at the mention of his father's name. The radio crackled with static before dispatch responded. Officer Brady, David Matthews' cell phone has been offline for approximately 4 hours. No credit card activity either. Do you need us to put out an APB? Caleb's heart dropped as he leaned closer to Cameron. They think Dad did this, he whispered, his voice trembling. Cameron's eyes widened with fear as he gripped his brother's arm tighter. Before Brady could respond to dispatch, 2 hospital security guards approached the waiting area. Their faces were stern as they addressed the boys. We need to take these minors to a secure location, one guard announced. Child Protective Services has been notified and will be here shortly to ensure their safety. No! Caleb jumped up, his blanket falling to the floor. We're not leaving our mom. You can't make us go. Tears streamed down his face as Cameron began to sob beside him. Brady immediately stepped between the guards and the boys. His voice was firm and authoritative. That won't be necessary. I'm Officer Brady from the 12th Precinct, and I'll be staying with these boys. He pulled out his badge, holding it up. This is now an active investigation, and they're under police protection. The security guards hesitated but eventually backed down. Brady guided the boys to a quiet consultation room, away from the busy hallway. The small room felt safer somehow, with its soft chairs and dim lighting. As they settled in, Brady sat across from the twins. His expression softened as he looked at their worried faces. I want to tell you something about my daughter, Emily, he said quietly. She was about your age when I lost her. I was stuck in traffic, couldn't get her to the hospital in time. He paused, taking a deep breath. That's why I had to help you tonight. I couldn't let another child lose their parent. Caleb listened intently, tears still glistening in his eyes. Officer Brady, he asked in a small voice, do you think our dad hurt Mom? Brady leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes things look bad when they're not, he said softly. We need to find out the truth before we make any judgments. Can you trust me to help with that? Both boys nodded, and Brady gave them a reassuring smile. The room fell quiet except for the distant sounds of hospital activity as they sat together in the growing uncertainty of the night. Brady guided the boys back into the quiet consultation room, pulling out his phone. He knelt down to Caleb's level, holding out the device. Here, try calling your dad. Maybe he'll pick up if he sees it's a different number. Caleb's hands trembled as he took the phone, quickly dialing his father's number. The ring seemed to echo in the small room. No answer. He tried again, his breathing getting faster with each attempt. Cameron watched, hugging himself tightly as the calls went straight to voicemail over and over. Dad, please, Caleb whispered, pressing redial one more time. Please pick up. Cameron's lower lip quivered as he looked at Brady. What if something happened to him too? His voice cracked with worry. What if he's hurt somewhere? The words hit Caleb hard. With a frustrated cry, he thrust the phone back at Brady and bolted from the room, running blindly down the hospital corridor. He crashed straight into a nurse, sending her armload of papers flying across the floor. I'm sorry, Caleb sobbed, already scrambling to get away. But Brady caught up with him quickly. The officer knelt down, placing steady hands on Caleb's shoulders as the nurse gathered her scattered paperwork. Look at me, Caleb. Brady said softly but firmly. "Your dad loves you. We'll find him." Caleb's shoulders shook as he tried to hold back tears. Brady led him back to the consultation room where Cameron waited anxiously. Once they were settled, Brady pulled out his phone again, this time dialing a different number. "Hey, Mark," he said to his friend in forensics. "I need a rush on those toxicology tests for Janelle Matthews. There might be an accidental explanation we're missing." As Brady spoke on the phone, Caleb leaned close to Cameron. "Maybe Dad didn't know he left something dangerous behind," he whispered, his voice full of desperate hope. Cameron grabbed his brother's hand, both boys clinging to the possibility that their father was innocent. The rain drummed against the hospital windows with increasing intensity, casting strange shadows across Janelle's pale face. Caleb and Cameron sat on either side of her bed, each holding one of her hands. The steady beep of monitors filled the otherwise quiet room. Brady stood near the doorway watching the scene unfold. His chest tightened as memories began to surface, unwanted but unstoppable. The fluorescent lights seemed to fade away as his mind drifted back to another hospital room, another bedside vigil. His daughter Emily lay there so small against the white sheets. Her tiny hand felt like a butterfly in his palm. "It's not your fault, Daddy," she had whispered, her last words carrying more grace than his heart could bear. The memory of her voice, still so clear after all these years, made his eyes burn. "Officer Brady." Caleb's excited voice yanked him back to the present. The boy was leaning forward, his eyes wide with hope. "She squeezed my hand. I think she's waking up." Brady rushed to the bedside, his heart pounding. Cameron gripped his mother's other hand tighter, watching her face intently. Janelle's eyelids fluttered and her lips moved slightly. "David," she mumbled, the word barely audible. "David." Caleb looked up at Brady, his eyes filling with tears. "You have to find Dad," he pleaded. "He can fix this. He always fixes everything." Brady looked at the boys' hopeful faces, then at Janelle's still form. The weight of their trust settled on his shoulders. He straightened up, decision made. He would find David Matthews and get the answers these children desperately needed. "I promise," he said softly, meaning every word. "I'll find your father." Brady squeezed Caleb's shoulder one last time before heading out into the stormy night. "I'll be back with your dad," he promised, nodding to the kind-faced nurse who would watch over the boys. His wet footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor as he strode toward the exit, determination burning in his chest. The drive to David's garage was treacherous. Rain pounded against Brady's windshield like angry fists, and his wipers could barely keep up. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, creating an eerie glow through the darkness. When he pulled up to the garage, something felt off. The building stood dark and silent, its windows black against the night sky. Brady grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the downpour, his uniform quickly becoming soaked. Inside the garage, his beam cut through the darkness, revealing a workspace in disarray. Tools lay scattered across the floor, and the air held a sharp chemical smell that made Brady's nose wrinkle. Following his instincts, he moved deeper into the space, scanning methodically. That's when he saw it, an open bottle of industrial solvent sitting near a broken ventilation fan. Brady's jaw clenched as he examined the label. "This could be it," he muttered, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The broken fan would have failed to clear the fumes, letting them build up in the house next door where Janelle had been. Back in his car, Brady radioed for information about David's truck and got a hit at a local diner. He found the vehicle parked behind the building, partially hidden from the street. Through the rain-streaked window, he could make out David's slumped form in the driver's seat. Brady yanked open the door, finding David asleep and covered in grease stains. He grabbed the man's shoulder and shook him roughly awake. "Your wife's in the hospital and your boys drove her there," Brady shouted, his voice carrying both anger and urgency. David's eyes snapped open, confusion quickly giving way to horror. The color drained from his face as Brady's words sank in. "What? The boys drove?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The police cruiser cut through the rain-slicked streets, its wipers fighting against the downpour. David sat in the passenger seat, his face pale and drawn, hands trembling in his lap. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know," he muttered, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Brady glanced at him while navigating a sharp turn. "Tell me about the solvent in your garage," Brady pressed, his voice firm but not unkind. "The bottle by the broken fan." David's eyes widened with sudden understanding. His hand flew to his mouth as the realization hit him. "Oh God," he whispered. "I left that stuff open by accident. I was working late, fixing Mrs. Peterson's car. I must have forgotten to seal it when the power went out." His voice cracked. "It's my fault. The fumes. They must have seeped into the house." They pulled into the hospital parking lot, and David barely waited for the car to stop before jumping out. He ran through the emergency room doors, his work boots squeaking against the polished floor as he followed Brady's directions to Janelle's room. When David burst through the door, the sight of his wife lying pale in the hospital bed made his knees buckle. He collapsed beside her, grabbing her hand and pressing it to his forehead. "Dad!" Caleb and Cameron's voices rang out in unison. They launched themselves from their chairs, running to their father with tears streaming down their faces. "We thought you weren't coming," Caleb sobbed as David wrapped his arms around both boys, pulling them close. David's tears fell freely as he held his sons tight. "You saved her," he choked out. "You saved Mom, my brave, brave boys." His voice was thick with emotion as he looked at his children with a mixture of pride, love, and lingering disbelief at their courage. Officer Brady stepped back quietly, watching the family reunion through the doorway. He leaned against the wall in the hallway, his own eyes growing misty at the scene before him. A nurse approached him, holding a clipboard with test results. "Officer," she said softly, "the toxicology report confirms it. Industrial solvent fumes, consistent with the type used in auto repair. It was an accident." Brady exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing as the tension he'd been carrying finally released. His face softened with relief as he watched David holding his sons, the family whole again, despite everything they'd been through. The hospital room fell silent as Janelle's eyes fluttered open, her gaze slowly focusing on the faces around her. Her breathing, now steady and strong, filled the quiet space. David knelt beside her bed, his work-roughened hands gently holding hers. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he spoke. "I didn't know. I almost lost you." His shoulders shook with emotion as Janelle's fingers weakly squeezed his hand. The simple gesture was too much for David, and he broke down completely, pressing his forehead against their joined hands. On Janelle's other side, Caleb and Cameron pressed close to their mother's bed. Their small hands reached for her free one, their faces still showing traces of dried tears. "We love you, Mom," they whispered in unison, their voices trembling with relief and exhaustion. From his position in the doorway, Officer Brady watched the scene unfold. His face showed the wear of the night's events, but there was unmistakable pride in his eyes as he observed the family reunion. A nurse approached him quietly, her shoes making soft sounds against the floor. "She's going to make it," she said with a gentle nod. Brady let out a deep breath, as if he'd been holding it for hours. The weight of responsibility and fear that had pressed down on him since finding the boys in that car seemed to lift from his shoulders. Janelle's gaze drifted to where Brady stood. Despite her weakness, her eyes were clear and grateful as they met his. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "for saving us." Brady could only nod, too overwhelmed to speak. Before he could collect himself, Caleb broke away from his mother's bedside and ran to him, throwing his arms around Brady's waist in a fierce hug. "You're like our hero," Caleb whispered into Brady's uniform. Brady felt his throat tighten with emotion as he gently ruffled Caleb's hair. A small, genuine smile crossed his face as he looked down at the boy. "You two are the real heroes tonight," he said softly, his voice thick with feeling. The hospital room's peaceful atmosphere shattered as two stern-faced figures strode in. The hospital administrator, a tall woman with wire-rimmed glasses, carried a clipboard and wore an expression of practiced disapproval. Beside her walked a younger woman in a navy blazer, the CPS representative. Mr. and Mrs. Walker, the administrator began, her voice crisp and formal. We need to discuss the events of last night. She glanced pointedly at Caleb and Cameron, who instinctively moved closer to their mother's bed. 2 children drove a vehicle unsupervised during a severe storm, she continued, each word sharp and accusatory. There need to be consequences for such reckless behavior. David stood up from his chair beside Janelle's bed, his face flushing with anger. Consequences? He demanded, his voice rising. They saved their mother's life. My boys are heroes. The CPS representative stepped forward, her expression gentler but still professional. Mr. Walker, we understand the circumstances were unusual, but we have protocols. Protocols? David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. My wife could have died if they hadn't acted. Officer Brady, who had been quietly observing from near the window, moved to the center of the room. His presence seemed to fill the space, commanding attention without raising his voice. Let me tell you what really happened last night, he said, his tone steady and authoritative. I found 2 terrified children who had exhausted every other option. They tried calling 911. They tried getting help from neighbors. When nothing else worked, they remembered what their father taught them and made an impossible choice. Brady's eyes met each person's gaze as he spoke. Those boys didn't just drive a car. They fought through a storm, navigated flooded streets, and kept their heads when most adults would have panicked. They did everything right in an impossible situation. The administrator opened her mouth to speak, but Brady held up his hand. If you're looking for negligence, you won't find it here. These parents taught their children well enough that they could think critically in a crisis. If Caleb and Cameron hadn't acted exactly as they did, we'd be standing over a tragedy right now. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and everyone in the room could hear the weight of his own past loss in his voice. They didn't break the rules, Brady continued, his voice growing stronger. They beat impossible odds, and I was there. I saw their courage, their quick thinking, and their love for their mother. That's not a story of neglect, it's a story of extraordinary children rising to an extraordinary moment. The room fell silent. Caleb and Cameron watched Brady with wide, grateful eyes. Janelle reached out and squeezed David's hand, tears streaming down her face. The CPS representative exchanged glances with the administrator before softening her stance. Given the circumstances and Officer Brady's testimony, she said, her tone notably warmer, no charges will be filed. However, she added, looking at David and Janelle, we will need to schedule follow-up visits to ensure proper safety measures are in place. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Caleb and Cameron's shoulders relaxed, and small, tentative smiles appeared on their faces. They felt protected, shielded by Brady's unwavering support. Janelle looked at Brady, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Not just for saving us, but for defending my boys. Sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, painting warm stripes across the linoleum floor. The storm that had brought such chaos the night before had finally passed, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent in the air. The morning felt peaceful, almost like nature itself was taking a deep, relieved breath. Caleb and Cameron sat on either side of Janelle's hospital bed, each holding one of her hands. Their mother's face, though still pale, held a gentle smile as she looked at her boys. The steady beeping of the heart monitor provided a comforting rhythm to their quiet moment together. My brave boys, Janelle whispered, squeezing their hands weakly. Caleb's eyes welled up with tears, but this time they were tears of relief, not fear. Cameron leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. Outside in the hospital parking lot, David stood next to Officer Brady, both men squinting at the brightening sky. The clouds had broken apart, revealing patches of brilliant blue. Puddles from the storm reflected the sunlight like scattered mirrors across the pavement. David ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his voice thick with emotion. I was so caught up in work, he admitted softly. I missed how much my boys had grown. All those extra hours at the garage. He shook his head, struggling to find the right words. I never saw what was right in front of me. And then his voice cracked. They saved her. They did what I couldn't because I wasn't there. He turned to Brady, his eyes filled with gratitude. I can't thank you enough for what you did for us, for protecting them, for bringing everyone home safe. Brady stood quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last storm clouds were disappearing. The morning sun caught the badge on his uniform, making it gleam. Sometimes we get a second chance, he said, his voice reflective and gentle. It's up to us not to waste it. David nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning behind Brady's words. The weight of the past night's events, the near tragedy, and the miracle of their children's bravery settled between them in a moment of shared understanding. In the hospital cafeteria, morning sunlight poured through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the small group seated at a corner table. Officer Brady sat across from Caleb and Cameron, watching as the boys dug into steaming plates of pancakes drowned in maple syrup. The simple breakfast felt like a celebration after the long, terrifying night they'd endured. Caleb looked up from his plate, a bit of syrup on his chin, and a genuine smile spread across his face. We're having breakfast with a cop, he said, his eyes brightening. That's kinda cool. Cameron, who had been quiet and withdrawn since their mother stabilized, suddenly let out a small laugh. The sound seemed to surprise even him, and soon both boys were giggling, the tension that had gripped them for hours finally beginning to crack. Brady couldn't help but smile, remembering countless mornings spent in diners just like this, drinking coffee alone after his night shifts. But this morning felt different, lighter somehow, despite his exhaustion. He watched the twins share knowing looks across their plates, their unique bond evident in every gesture. You know, Brady said, reaching for his badge, I've been thinking about something. He unpinned the golden shield from his uniform, holding it carefully in his hands. The metal caught the morning light, gleaming as he extended it toward Caleb. The boy's eyes widened as Brady placed the badge in his small hands. Caleb held it reverently, running his fingers over the raised numbers and letters. This badge, Brady explained, his voice gentle but serious, means protecting people. It means doing what's right, even when it's scary. He glanced between the two boys. And you two did that better than most adults I know tonight. Caleb beamed at the praise, holding the badge like it was made of precious gold. Cameron leaned in closer to his brother, both of them studying the symbol of authority with wonder in their eyes. Really? Caleb asked softly, still tracing the badge's outline. Really, Brady confirmed with a firm nod. What you did for your mom, that took real courage. The cafeteria door opened and David walked in, holding something behind his back. His face showed signs of exhaustion, but his eyes were clear and focused as he approached the table. He pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package from behind his back, a toy car still in its original packaging. Caleb's eyes grew even wider as he recognized it, the exact model they'd seen in the store window months ago, the one David had promised but never delivered. David knelt beside the table, bringing himself to eye level with his sons. I know I haven't been around as much as I should, David said, his voice thick with emotion. I've been so busy trying to provide for our family that I forgot what family really means. He placed the toy car on the table, but his eyes stayed locked on his sons' faces. You were braver than I ever could have imagined. I'm so proud of you both. Caleb looked from the toy car to his father's face, surprise and joy mixing in his expression. Cameron reached out and touched the package tentatively, as if making sure it was real. The simple gift represented more than just a toy. It was a promise of change, of attention, of presence. Brady watched the scene unfold, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning coffee. The badge in Caleb's hands glinted in the sunlight, a reminder of the extraordinary night that had brought them all together. Days after the harrowing night at the hospital, warm afternoon sunlight filtered through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal filled the air as David knelt beside an old engine, carefully pointing out different parts to Caleb and Cameron. The twins listened intently, their eyes bright with curiosity and understanding. Inside the house, Janelle rested comfortably on the living room couch, wrapped in a soft blanket. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her breathing was steady and strong. She could hear the muffled voices and occasional laughter drifting in from the garage, sounds that filled her heart with contentment. David had taken time off work to be with his family, making good on his promise to be more present. He showed the boys how to safely handle tools, explaining everything with patience and care. This time together meant more than just learning about cars. It was healing, bringing them closer with every shared moment. "See this part here?" David asked, pointing to a component in the engine. "This is where..." The distinct sound of tires on gravel interrupted his explanation. Caleb's head snapped up at the familiar rumble of a police cruiser's engine. He scrambled to his feet, eyes wide with excitement as he recognized the vehicle pulling up outside. "Brady's here!" Caleb shouted, already running toward the driveway. Cameron followed close behind, their footsteps echoing through the garage. Officer Brady stepped out of his cruiser, now dressed in casual clothes instead of his uniform. His face broke into a warm smile as he watched the boys approach. Caleb reached him first, practically bouncing with enthusiasm. David wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over, extending his hand to Brady. "Good to see you," he said warmly, giving Brady's hand a firm shake. "You're always welcome here." "I appreciate that," Brady replied, clearly touched by the genuine welcome. He reached back into his cruiser and pulled out something wrapped in simple blue paper. Caleb and Cameron exchanged curious glances as Brady knelt down to their level. "I brought something for you two," he said, carefully handing over the package. With eager fingers, Caleb unwrapped the gift while Cameron watched. Inside was a detailed model police car, painted in the exact colors of Brady's cruiser. But what made it special were the names Caleb and Cameron carefully painted along the sides in golden letters. Caleb lifted the car like it was a precious trophy, his face glowing with joy. "Look, Cameron, it's got our names," he exclaimed, turning it to show his brother. Cameron stepped closer, running his finger gently over the letters. His usual shyness melted away as he looked up at Brady with a soft smile. "We're keeping it forever," he said quietly but firmly. Brady's eyes grew misty at Cameron's words. He watched as the boys examined every detail of the toy car, their expressions full of wonder and appreciation. This small gesture meant more than just a gift. It was a reminder of their shared experience, their bravery, and the unexpected bond that had formed between them. Janelle appeared in the doorway, supported by David, wanting to join the moment. She smiled warmly at Brady, her presence a testament to the miracle they'd all been part of. The afternoon sun caught the toy police car's metallic paint, making it shine like a beacon of hope and courage in Caleb's hands. In the warm living room, Brady sat across from Janelle, sunlight streaming through the windows. The distant sounds of David and the boys working in the garage filtered through the walls, punctuated by occasional laughter. Janelle adjusted her position on the couch, her movements still careful but stronger than before. Her eyes met Brady's with understanding and gratitude. "You saved us," she said softly, her voice gentle. Then, after a thoughtful pause, she added, "But you saved yourself too, didn't you?" Brady's shoulders relaxed, and a look of quiet peace settled across his features. He nodded slowly, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. Outside in the driveway, Caleb and Cameron worked alongside David, their small hands now confident with the tools they held. When Brady stepped out to join them, both boys immediately perked up. "Look what we learned," Caleb called out excitedly, pointing to the spotless engine they'd just finished cleaning. Cameron nodded enthusiastically, holding up a wrench almost too big for his hands. Brady chuckled, watching as they demonstrated their new skills with proud determination. "You two are going to give your dad a run for his money," he said warmly, making both boys beam with pride. As the afternoon drew to a close, Brady walked back to his cruiser. The family gathered in the driveway to wave goodbye. David with his arm around Janelle, the twins standing in front, still clutching their toy police car. Brady pulled away slowly, watching them in his rearview mirror until they became small figures in the distance. He glanced at the dashboard where a small photo was carefully tucked. a smiling young girl with his eyes, his daughter, Emily. Reaching out, he touched the photo gently with one finger. "We did good, Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We did good." The sun shone brightly as he drove down the quiet street, its warm rays catching the tears in his eyes. But these weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of healing, of a man who had finally found his peace. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, filling the room with a golden glow. Weeks had passed since that stormy night, and the house hummed with renewed life and warmth. Janelle stood at the stove, her movements strong and sure as she flipped pancakes, the sweet aroma filling the air. At the kitchen table, Caleb and Cameron sat side by side, their laughter echoing through the room as they shared jokes between bites of breakfast. Their voices carried a lightness that had been missing in the days after their mother's illness. David entered through the back door, his toolbox in hand, pausing to take in the scene before him. His eyes softened as he watched his family, appreciating the simple beauty of the moment in a way he never had before. The sound of his boys' laughter, the sight of Janelle's smile. These weren't things to take for granted anymore. Outside in the yard, the morning sun warmed the dewy grass as Caleb and Cameron tossed a baseball back and forth. Their game paused at the familiar sound of tires on pavement. A gleaming police cruiser pulled up to the curb and Officer Brady stepped out, holding a small box under his arm. "Brady!" Caleb shouted, dropping the ball and racing across the lawn with Cameron close behind. Their faces lit up with excitement as they reached him. "You didn't forget about us." Caleb beamed, bouncing on his toes. Brady's warm smile matched theirs as he knelt down to their level. He held out the box, and the boys opened it eagerly. Inside lay 2 pairs of child-sized mechanic gloves, each with their names carefully stitched in blue thread. "You've got big shoes to fill," Brady said warmly, watching their faces light up even more. "But I think you'll manage." Caleb and Cameron slipped on their gloves, admiring how they fit perfectly. David emerged from the garage, crossing the yard to join them. He placed a strong hand on Brady's shoulder, his voice full of genuine affection as he said, "You're part of the family now." The words settled in the morning air, carrying the weight of truth and gratitude that bound them all together. The school hallways buzzed with excitement as students gathered for the special assembly. Whispers and wide-eyed stares followed Caleb and Cameron as they walked past their classmates. The twins could hear snippets of conversation floating around them. "They actually drove a car?" one student gasped. "In that huge storm too," another added. "That's crazy." Caleb felt his cheeks grow warm, a mix of nervousness and pride making his stomach flutter. Cameron stayed close to his brother's side, their shoulders brushing as they made their way to the front of the assembly hall. Principal Matthews stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the packed room. "Today, we honor 2 of our own students who showed extraordinary courage in the face of danger." Officer Brady stepped forward, his police uniform crisp and badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His presence commanded attention, but his eyes were gentle as he looked at the twins. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. "Courage isn't about being fearless," Brady began, his voice strong and clear. "Courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what's right, even when it's hard." He paused, letting his words sink in. "These 2 boys didn't just save their mother, they reminded us of what it means to care for each other." The assembly hall erupted in thunderous applause. Principal Matthews stepped forward, holding 2 shining medals. She placed them around Caleb and Cameron's necks, the metal cool against their skin. After the ceremony, students swarmed around the twins, their voices overlapping with questions. "Were you super scared? How did you reach the pedals? Did the police really chase you?" Cameron, usually quiet in crowds, found his voice. "We just did what we had to do," he said softly but firmly. Caleb caught his brother's eye and leaned close. "We're kind of famous now," he whispered with a grin. Cameron smiled back, his hand touching the medal around his neck. The morning sun streamed through the assembly hall windows, making the medals gleam like stars against their shirts. The morning air was crisp and clear as Officer Brady walked through the peaceful cemetery, a small bouquet of flowers clutched in his hands. The grass crunched softly beneath his feet as he made his way to Emily's headstone, his heart heavy yet somehow lighter than it had been in years. He knelt before the grave, gently placing the flowers against the cool stone. From his pocket, he withdrew the toy police car Caleb had given him, a simple gesture that had meant the world to him. He set it carefully beside the flowers, his fingers lingering on its smooth surface. "I met 2 kids, Emily," Brady said softly, his voice breaking the morning silence. "Brave like you. They reminded me why I put on this uniform." As he knelt there, memories of that stormy night washed over him like gentle waves. He saw Caleb's determined face behind the steering wheel, heard the boy's tearful plea in the hospital parking lot. He remembered the moment Janelle opened her eyes, the family whole again. Each memory felt like a step away from his crushing grief, toward something brighter. "I hope I made you proud," he whispered, touching the letters of Emily's name carved in stone. The words came easier now, without the crushing weight of guilt that had accompanied them for so long. Brady stood slowly, brushing off his knees. The cemetery stretched out before him, peaceful under the morning sky. For the first time in years, his shoulders felt light, as if a burden had finally lifted. The grief that had defined him for so long had transformed into something else, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. As he walked back to his patrol car, sunlight broke through the clouds above, warming his face. The rays caught the badge on his chest, making it shine, just like it had the day Emily had first touched it with her small fingers, her eyes full of pride for her daddy, the police officer. The morning sun streamed through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Caleb and Cameron sat on wooden stools beside their father's workbench, their eyes bright with excitement. David wiped his hands on a red shop rag and smiled at his sons. "All right, boys, time to get your hands dirty," David said, reaching for the special mechanic gloves Brady had given them. The twins' names gleamed in white stitching against the black material. Caleb pulled his gloves on eagerly while Cameron carefully adjusted each finger. David showed them how to check the oil, explaining each step with patience he'd never shown before. The boys hung on every word, asking questions and pointing at different parts of the engine. The garage door creaked open and Officer Brady stepped in, holding a pink box of donuts. He chuckled at the sight of Caleb, who had somehow managed to get a dark smudge of grease across his cheek while peering under the hood. "Your new deputies are on the job," David quipped, nodding toward the boys. Brady's face lit up with a warm grin. "I'll take 'em," he said, setting the donuts on a clean workbench. The garage filled with easy laughter as David guided Cameron's small hands through the process of checking spark plugs. Brady leaned against the wall, watching the scene with quiet contentment. Caleb excitedly pointed out different engine parts he remembered from their dramatic drive, but now the memory brought smiles instead of fear. The door opened again, and Janelle appeared carrying a tray of fresh lemonade. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before her, her husband teaching their sons, Brady watching over them all like a guardian angel, the sunshine making everything glow with warmth. Her heart swelled at the sight of her family, stronger and more united than ever before. "Who's thirsty?" she called out, and 4 heads turned toward her with matching grins. The sound of happy chatter and clinking glasses filled the garage as they gathered around the workbench, sharing donuts and lemonade. Caleb demonstrated his new mechanical knowledge, while Cameron carefully wiped grease from his gloves. David's arm rested around Janelle's shoulders, and Brady sat comfortably among them, no longer a stranger, but family. The evening settled softly around the family home as they gathered at the dinner table. Steam rose from plates of spaghetti and meatballs, Janelle's specialty, as Caleb and Cameron could barely contain their excitement about their day at the garage. "And then Dad showed us how to check the timing belt," Caleb exclaimed, his fork waving in the air. "Don't forget the spark plugs," Cameron added, his eyes bright. "We did those all by ourselves." David watched his sons with a warm smile spreading across his face. "You know what? You two might take over the shop someday." He winked at Janelle, who was trying not to laugh at their enthusiasm. "As long as you don't drive without permission again?" she teased, raising an eyebrow at the twins. "We promise," the boys groaned in unison, but their grins gave away their playful mood. After dinner, they migrated to the living room couch, settling into their usual spots. The TV hummed quietly in the background, but no one paid attention to it. Caleb fidgeted with the hem of his shirt before looking up at his father. "Dad?" he asked, his voice suddenly small. "Are you still mad at us?" David's expression softened as he pulled Caleb into a tight hug. "Mad?" He reached out and drew Cameron into the embrace too. "You saved your mom's life. I'll never stop being proud of you both." The warmth from the living room lamp spilled out onto the quiet street where Officer Brady sat in his patrol car. He watched the family through the window, their silhouettes moving in the golden light. The scene before him painted a picture of everything he'd helped preserve: love, family, second chances. A gentle smile crossed his face as he whispered to himself, "Everyone deserves a second chance." With that, he started his car and drove off into the night, his heart full of contentment. The patrol car's taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving the family to their peaceful evening together. The morning sun painted the suburban street in warm golden light. Dew sparkled on the grass as birds chirped their cheerful morning songs. Caleb and Cameron burst through the front door, their excitement impossible to contain. "Race you to the garage," Caleb called out, already sprinting ahead. "No fair, you got a head start." Cameron laughed, chasing after his brother. From the kitchen window, Janelle watched her family with a tender smile. She held a steaming cup of coffee close to her chest, taking in the scene before her. David stood in the garage doorway, his work apron already on, tools laid out carefully on his workbench. The sight of her husband waiting patiently for their sons filled her heart with joy. "Okay, boys," David called out as the twins skidded to a stop in front of him. "Today we're learning about carburetors." "What's that?" Cameron asked, pulling on his child-sized work gloves. "It's like the car's stomach," David explained with a grin. "It helps mix the fuel and air together." The peaceful morning scene was interrupted by the familiar sound of a police cruiser pulling into their driveway. Caleb's face lit up as he recognized the vehicle. "Brady's here!" he shouted, abandoning the lesson and running toward the car. Cameron followed close behind, their work gloves still on. Officer Brady stepped out of his cruiser, a wide smile on his weathered face. His uniform was crisp and neat, but his eyes held the warmth of a close friend rather than the stern authority of a police officer. "Well, if it isn't my two favorite mechanics," Brady called out, reaching into his pocket, "I've got something special for you both." The boys crowded around him, bouncing with anticipation. Brady pulled out two shiny toy police badges, holding them up in the morning light. "For my honorary officers," he said softly, pinning one badge to each boy's shirt. "Because sometimes the bravest heroes don't wear uniforms." Caleb and Cameron stared at their badges in awe, touching them gently as if they might disappear. Janelle had come outside to join them, standing beside David as they watched the touching scene unfold. "Thank you, Brady," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, thanks," Cameron added, his shy smile bright enough to rival the morning sun. The driveway filled with warm laughter and animated conversation as Brady shared stories from his patrol route. David's arm wrapped around Janelle's waist as they listened to the boys pepper Brady with questions about police work. The morning light streamed through the oak trees that lined their street, casting dappled shadows that danced around them. The scene was more than just a family moment. It was a testament to the power of love, courage, and second chances. The sunlight filtering through the leaves seemed to bless their gathering, a gentle reminder that even after the darkest storms, hope always finds a way to shine through. Caleb proudly wore both his mechanic's gloves and his new police badge, a perfect symbol of how their family had grown and changed. Cameron stayed close to his brother, their twin bond stronger than ever after their shared adventure. And Brady stood among them not as an officer, but as part of their family, his own heart healed by the very people he had helped save. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Brady, Caleb, and Cameron, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.